I don't know if there's definitely some baseline of like smartness needed for programming, but I think it's mostly just stubbornness. So if none of this is clicking for you, that's okay. This is your first exposure to this. I had to expose myself to this for like a year before anything made sense. So I hope that what I can impart to you today is helpful. And if it's confusing, the onus is on me. But I love talking about this stuff and would love to meet and answer questions that anyone has. So can you enable screen sharing, please? Cool, cool, cool. Okay. Today's talk is entitled A Little JavaScript Goes a Long Way. These slides are available at alittleJS.netlify.app and were made using R. They're incredibly extra. But I can be reached at mycelium on Twitter if you have any questions after this talk. So as Batul mentioned, we're going to go under the hood and look at Shiny and then talk about communication from R to JavaScript and then JS back to R. But I want this talk to be as accessible to everyone as possible. So I'm going to give the world's fastest intro to Shiny. And there's incredible free resources out there to learn Shiny. Happy to talk about that after this talk. So here's a Shiny app. I'm in Chrome, I'm in my browser, and I have this user interface. So the first assumed knowledge of this talk is I've rendered a Palmer Penguin's ggplot here. So you're running R code. So that's the foundation here. You might not know Shiny, but we're R programmers. And what you see here is the build depth of these penguins on that y-axis and the flipper length on the x-axis. So that's a ggplot, familiar with plotting x and y in your aesthetics. What Shiny enables us to do is on the left-hand side here, we have these drop downs and we can dynamically toggle and change things iteratively within this user interface. So Shiny apps have two major components, this user interface in the browser that we just saw, and then the server, the R code that's running your user interface. So for now, this demo app that you saw is running on my local machine, but you can run things with Shiny Apps IO or other means beyond the scope of this talk to share it with other people. But I want you to take away two components, the user interface, the visual that you have and the user gets to interact with, and then running our code. And footnote, not only are these slides available, but all these demo apps, this one and all subsequent apps are available in my GitHub repo that is also linked. That's another thing. I don't assume for everyone to get all of this first pass, but you'll have access to that code and can really let it marinate and work through it, break it. That's how I learn. All right, so that UI component, we have this UI function where Shiny has these helper functions to create that sidebar panel, those different select drop downs, and then you specify, I'm going to call my plot penguin plot. And then again, just reiterating the server, their server function is where we actually do that R programming logic. And the magical function of Shiny is you have this function Shiny app that says, take that UI function, take the server function, put them together, boom, we have this Shiny app that I can now, given when I click on this, it's triggering our code. So that's cool. That's Shiny in a nutshell. Going any further than that, there's books on it, great free videos on it. Talk about that later. For the rest of this, for a big chunk of this talk rather, we're going to talk about this Shiny app that is literally 6 lines of code, and it's basically going to be like an ode to how rad Shiny is, really diving into what is going on under the hood with these 6 lines of code. So in my UI, I have a button. The name of the button is button demo, and I want to display the word click on the button. And then I want to trigger some event when I click the button. So in the console, I'm just going to log button clicked. So this is me being insane, having interactions in my slides, but you can click on that button and see button click. This is quote unquote exactly what our Shiny app would look like. Just a button, print. What is happening under the hood here is actually 3 new languages. So the first thing is Hypertext markup language, which is HTML. For those who are not familiar, HTML is a hierarchical language used to structure your web pages. So you have these elements that are created using tags. So you see here a button is created with the button tag, and then there's always a closing tag at the end of it. And what I mean by hierarchical is your page, you can explore it by saying, I have my whole web page. Within that, I want a header and a section. Within my section, I want a paragraph. Within my paragraph, I want an image. And so this is actually incredibly useful for accessibility and to leverage how to navigate around the page. But that is how you kind of lay out what I want the nuts and bolts of this website. Okay, so in our instance, the only thing we have on the page is a button. So that's why we have this button tag. Inside the tag, you put the guts of what you want in there, click, that's our text, and then we finish it off with the closing tag. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, without which the internet would be a very boring place, in my opinion. CSS, the language, is made of rules. So here we have a rule where you say on the outside of the curly brackets what you want to apply that rule to. So for all buttons, the button tags, and then within the brackets, we always have a property, colon, value, semicolon. So my property is a background color and the value is pink. So now all my buttons are gonna be pink. So wrap that all together, that's called a rule, property, value. So now I have a page with a button. But why is the internet awesome? Because we get to do stuff. We get to interact with our pages. And we need JavaScript in order to do that. JavaScript is the language of the internet. Here is the code that I used to display that button changed under my button on the previous slide here, button clicked. Essentially, I said you have a little container that's empty. And when you click on the button, I want you to give me the text button clicked. So without JavaScript, we would have no reactivity. Digging in a little more, let's go back here to this action button. All I'm doing here is looking at the source code of that. And there's a lot going on here, but I highlighted in blue what I want to focus on, and it's tags $button, which is literally what we just talked about. Shiny has a function tags button that is, it takes on arguments and you get to put those inside your button tags. So what's happening here is Shiny's code is a wrapper, is an HTML wrapper. We don't even have to look at HTML, know about it, but this is what's happening for us. What about CSS? So in my example, we gave styling to all buttons, but what if I have 12 buttons on my page and I want 7 of them to be blue? So in CSS, we can leverage what's called classes. So we can give our button a class, and then we prefix in our CSS rules classes with a period. So now I'm saying everything with class BTN is going to have certain styling. Everything of class button blue is going to be blue. Everything of class button red is going to be red. You can have multiple classes on elements, and they're space separated. Elements can also have IDs, and these are a one-to-one relationship. One button, Maya's button, that's all I get on the page. Otherwise, we're going to have Batul's button, right? Like there's one of those, but both of those can be pink buttons. And all of this CSS you get for free, shiny, amazing. I don't have to write any of that. Lastly, the JavaScript code. I have a scrolling image of how long the JavaScript shiny source code is. If I were to go over this, the name of the talk would be "A Lot of JavaScript Goes a Long Way," not a little, but I just wanted to show you how it's also making sure when we click on that button, it does the thing that we want it to do. So thank you, Shiny, for doing all that for us. But now we're nerds, we want to build that ourselves. So let's start with this bottom button here. I have my button of class BTN. The guts of it say click me. So, and I styled it so that on hover, you get this little shadow. So that's cool. But what about this button? When you give this button the property of disabled, I want you to change not only change the opacity of the button, but also when we hover over it, we see this can't click me sign. And this is a really great functionality if you were to like build a form and someone doesn't, and there's a submit button, but you don't want to let the user submit unless they have all their mandatory fields filled out. That's kind of an example that I've used this for. But I can foresee a lot of reasons of wanting to disable certain buttons in certain instances. So how do we do this? We need to communicate this button that we created in R and turn it off using JavaScript. So when I click this button with this ID, I want to do something in JavaScript. When I click demo button, I want to disable it using JavaScript. And how do we do this? Okay. So this actually took me a long time to wrap my head around. But in R, our comfort zone, our happy place on the left-hand side of the screen, we send a message to JavaScript, and the name of that message will be disable. This function takes on 2 arguments. The first is just a string. It's going to be the message, disable. And the second one is an argument to the function. And we're just going to hold off on what that one does. Then in the JS side, JS is listening for a message, but we have to register what messages to listen for. It doesn't just have its ear open, ready to listen to R say whatever it wants. We have to say, there's this word disable, that when you hear that, I want you to run this function disable button. Okay, and disable button is a JavaScript function. And here we're using Jquery, which is, you can kind of think of it as like a package for JavaScript that lets us query our HTML really easily, using that same syntax that I was talking about, like with the period and classes. So we have a $sign here, and we're saying, give me the element with the ID that I'm passing from R, button ID, and set its property, l.prop, disabled to true. So now that's how I'm going to get that disabled property, going back a slide, this disabled property on that button. So send my message disabled, grab my message disabled, do this thing, given this argument I got from R. So now back in R, I have this wrapper function disable element, which is going to send that custom message disable along with the button's ID I want to disable. And then this is, again, just reiterating that same thing on the prior slide. Listen for disable. This is what you're going to do when you disable. Now, being fancy, we don't just want to disable the element. We also want to take that property off and set that property to false. So that way we can click on the button when we want it. So just like I had that disable code, we have the same exact enable code setting that property of disable to false. Now, it's kind of contrived to have these as 2 buttons. But again, kind of think of the first one as a form that this button affects if this button can be clicked or not. So when we click on this, we can no longer click on this one. Click on it again, we get that functionality back. And again, all this code is going to be available. I realize there's a lot quickly. We're doing it. What's happening here is being tricky. And in Shiny, buttons actually have numbers associated with them. So every time you click a button, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And what I'm saying is when that number is even, set this to enabled, otherwise set it to disabled. And that's how I'm getting that sending the message disabled on odd and enabled on even to JavaScript. And JavaScript's like, I got you. I know what to do with that message. So that is R to JavaScript. And as Patul said, the only way you're going to really do this, get this, is to struggle and think of cool instances that you want to implement, and like feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. Happy to collab on code and get this working, because the only way you're really going to get it is getting your hands dirty. But sending that message, receiving that message, that took me a long time to wrap my head around. Okay, here's a whole other, so not even stopping to pause here, whole new chapter, talking from JavaScript to R. I want to do fancy things in JavaScript and have those accessible to my R code. I don't know why you would do this, but I want to do some data transformation in JavaScript because you're a masochist, and then I want that to be available to me in R. So in my example here, R has a lot of inputs, like that drop down we saw. There's also a numeric one. There's checkboxes. There's lots of fun things and shiny widgets that your users can interact with. But my little example here is, well, I want to create a custom input of different colored circles. And I want in R to be able to grab the color of the circle that the user selected. And I am not good at being abstract, so I have an example here. But first, I'm going to skip that slide for now. This is what I want. I have this input, and when you click on it, I want red to be available to me in R so that I can filter my data set based on red, filter my data set based on blue. You know what I mean? I don't know if anyone knows what I mean, but I'm just going to keep going. So when I click, I return to R, I have this value readily available to me. So how do we do this? This part is even more difficult than the first one. So happy to answer questions. And again, all this code is going to be available. But what we're going to do is create our own R wrapper, just like our HTML wrapper, just like R has that action button wrapper. Shiny has all these HTML wrappers. We're going to make our own HTML wrapper. And what's really cool is there's this amazing function called HTML dependency, which if we call that in our wrapper, we're essentially saying not only create this HTML, but also footnote, attach this JavaScript file with my R code. So every time the user calls us, they don't have to worry about it, but we know this JavaScript file exists. And that's what we're going to use to return that circle color to us. So from a user perspective, like I'm creating this circle input, and I want Hypha to be able to use this, right? Hypha never has to deal with this JavaScript file. They just get this little code here where they get to call circle input. I'm calling it circles. And then I want to shove a text output out just to like debug and make sure it's working right, where we're going to render the text of this input, what that input is returning back to us. So again, when I click on the red, blue, yellow. So the user of the function never has to deal with this JavaScript stuff, but we get to. What does this look like? So this is a little more complicated than button end tag button, but SVGs are scalable vector graphics, and we can think of them just like there's that hierarchical nature of web pages. You have the same thing for images in web pages, and it's called scalable vector graphics, and they're amazing. There's also incredible tools of learning and learning how to work with SVGs, and I think you can work with SVGs in ggplot too. But yeah, that's tangent. So what I want you to focus on high level here is, here's my HTML dependency that I'm saying, there's this file circles.js that exists. Please know about it whenever the user runs this function circle input. And then the actual, what you return from that function is a container. And within that container, I have a blue circle, sorry, a red circle, a blue circle, and a yellow circle. And what I want you to focus on here is we've talked about how elements can have properties of IDs. They can have classes, but we can also make up our own fun ones. And here I've called it circle type. And the circle type corresponds to that circle's color. So here is what happens in my JavaScript code. Again, this is leveraging jQuery. That's all the exclamation points. We need to wrap everything that's happening on a document ready function because JavaScript is weird, and coming from R, the biggest thing to grapple with is you need to start caring about when your functions run, not just functions and things occurring linearly. So you're saying, I want this function to be available to me at all times when the page is loaded. And this code here is get this container with ID circle. So a pound sign is ID, just the dot was class, pound is ID. And when you click on that whole container, the thing that you clicked on, get attribute circle type, and then in JavaScript, just like we have the Shiny package in R, there's the Shiny package in JavaScript. So Shiny dot here, if you squint, is like Shiny colon colon, calling a function from the Shiny package. We're going to set the input value of a string of our choice to the clicked on circle type. Okay, so this first argument allows me in R to say input $circles, give it to me. And it sets it to the circle type that we clicked on. But this code is incredibly fragile for two reasons. One is statically assigning the ID of the circle. So if I change this to Maya circle, JavaScript's going to be like, you just told me to find a thing of ID circle, and that doesn't exist. It doesn't know about Maya circle, so we want to make this more dynamic. And then the second one that returns input $circles, that can still hold true because we set the input to circles. But if you want to think like a Shiny developer, this string always matches this string. So this would be very cumbersome for the user. That said, this code, if you play with it, starting to develop yourself with JavaScript, I think is like the easiest of the hards to go through. So I think a fun exercise here, like if you want to stretch yourself, would be right now these three circles are hard coded to be red, blue, and yellow. What would happen if you pass in R, you let your user pick the colors that they want, and what'll happen? Will that break your code? Trying to make that work could be a fun exercise to try to work through this in a low pressure environment. Okay, so we're gonna need to do a lot of work to make this more dynamic, to not, again, this is the code if we want to say hard-coded, look for this ID that I know about, hard-coded, input $circles is always going to give me the color. We're going to need to change this code quite a bit to enable the user picking the ID and then JavaScript being like, oh, I got you. I know what this ID is that the user put in. Leave that as an argument rather than a static string. So for those of you who are familiar with operational programming, like R6 or S3 type of thing, that's highly used in JavaScript. If you're not, all good, stay calm, I got you. What we're doing is creating our own custom Shiny binding. And to be honest, I like copy and paste this all the time as a template for doing this. And again, all this code is free for you to use on the internet. But when you create a binding, there's these 4 different methods I want you to think about and leverage. There's a lot more methods than just these, but these are the 4 that we'll start with today that you need to assign in order to hook up your JavaScript with your R code. So let's start with the top and the bottom here. I'm going to create a new Shiny binding. And here I'm saying register that binding. This Shiny circle binding, this code is connected to circle input. They are sisters and they love each other and they will always be together. Okay, so the first method is the find function. So you have to tell your input what to look for. And here I said, find the class circle input, and that is the container holding all 3 of my circles. So imagine an invisible container around this whole area. I want that to be our JavaScript listener. Anything that happens in this square is now a part of my Shiny input. And now I'm going to skip this for just a second, because in our subscribe function, we tell Shiny what to do in this area. So in this class, in this box, whenever you click on something, I'm going to skip this line, and I promise you I'll come back to it. I want you to, the event target, the thing that was clicked, give it the class selected. Now let's hop back upstairs to get value. Get value is what is returned to R. And what we're saying here is find that class selected. And then, so if we selected this blue circle, it's now going to have this additional class selected. And then we say with a Jquery, give me the attribute of the circle type. So it's going to return circle blue. And that value is exactly what Shiny is going to receive. So here you say, give me the whole thing. Here you say, when you click on a specific circle, give it the class selected. And then the get value is give me the circle type of the selected thing. Okay, Maya, you skipped this line. So let's say I clicked on the red circle and I gave it the class selected and it returns red and things are great. And then I click on the blue circle and Shiny's going to be like, what the hell? I don't know. Now the red circle is selected and the blue circle is selected. What do I do here? So this line is saying, start with a blank canvas every time the user clicks, remove all prior instances of the selected class. So that way it can start fresh, nobody's selected, and now the user clicks on the selected circle. And then you unsubscribe when you finish. And that is a lot. I have a total expert blind spot at this point of how, if anything I even said makes sense. So I'm also looking forward to people coming back to me and telling me, hey, you didn't explain this well, because I too am learning. Teaching is learning. So that is how we get JavaScript info into R. And this was a lot of information in a very little time. These are 2 books that you must read, by JavaScript for R by John Cohn and David Granjon's Outstanding User Interfaces with Shiny. They're incredible resources, taught me everything I know. And then another way that I like to learn is, rather than get stuck in tutorial hell and just watching more things, you need to get dirty. And Shiny Widgets is this incredible library of custom widgets, and looking at their source code, that's when I was like, oh, find, and then this get value thing, and then the subscribe, hunting around and sleuthing in the source code is really helpful. Garrick's JS for Shiny, same thing, hunt around his code, everything he writes is brilliant. And then Jonathan Tratner also has a slide deck that is a pretty great resource. So I realize that was a ton of information, but I'm hoping you take away 0.1%, right? Wasn't that the statistic? So.
Wow, Maya, thank you so much. That's really insightful. You made me think of things that I've never thought about it before as well. We do have a few questions that Haifa is going to ask you in the Google Docs.
Yes, thank you, Maya, for this presentation and this great explanation. We have some few questions. So I will start with the first one. The first one is for the disable button example, which files does that code live in app.r or supplemental files for the GS CSS?
That's a good question. For boop, boop, boop. Sorry, I've so much going on here. Actually, let's go into the GitHub here. So we have our app in here. And then in our www file, we have the source.js file. And in app.r, we say include this script source.js. And that's the cool part about those bindings at the end, where like the harder it gets for you as the developer with the JavaScript craziness, the easier it gets for your users. Like for that circle input, your user never has to deal with the JavaScript file. But if this is just for you and for learning, this would be my like first step, including your JavaScript files. Does that get to what you were asking, I hope?
Yes.
Yes. Yes, the second question is, could you explain how to integrate JavaScript code with R? Is it necessary to always use HTML tools dependency?
No, as we have here, you can include the script. You write your JavaScript in a file and include it this way. Again, JavaScript is weird and when things happen matter. So I don't remember offhand, but if include script does this for free, but sometimes remember how HTML I described was like this hierarchical thing. Sometimes you'll need to make sure that your JavaScript file is loaded before the thing that you want to do something on. What do you mean by that? Okay, I have a button, and then after that I say sorry, I have this code that says when you click on Maya's button, make it red. And then I have the button. This code is going to be like, what button are you talking about? It doesn't exist yet because it isn't a thing. So you have to have the code available before that button is created, if that makes sense. So it's common to see in people's code like tags head included in the head of your, so it's before, so you don't have to worry about that. And then HTML dependency is really for when you want to hide all this JavaScript from your R user, when it's like TMI, I don't want to deal with that. So it's a good question. I think it depends on your use case.
Okay, great. So we have another question. Is what do you find the most frustrating, challenging aspect of integrating R Shiny and GS?
That's a great question. So I think Shiny is an amazing tool. As we saw, it's this magical wrapper of 3 different languages. And then when you want to customize things that Shiny made opinionated decisions about, and you want to override those, that can get a little tricky. But I think you can go a long, long way before getting frustrated with that. I think another frustrating thing for me is when you get into Shiny in production and like huge systems and you're running data in a database, but that again, that's like a whole other conversation about optimizing your Shiny code. Happy to talk about that and geek out at a later time.
Great. So another question is how are inputs handled, example, circles when using Shiny modules, and I think NSCS, since the input LD will be something circles.
Exactly. So that's a great comment. So if we put this in a module, this static code looking for pound sign circles, it's going to be like, I don't know what that is, because now you have some namespace dash circles situation happening. And that's why this code will help you with namespacing pretty much for free. Don't quote me on that. We'll probably play with this after to be sure, but that's by supplying it dynamically to Shiny as like a proper Shiny certified, verified binding. It's going to take care of that namespacing for you.
Okay, great. So the last question is, what the advantage of Shiny binding over simply Shiny dot settle input value?
Yeah, so that's what we were just talking about. I use this a lot in my like personal code when I can memorize. Okay, let's say I have namespace modules. So I have Maya's module 1 dash button, and I have that memorized, so I can put that in here. And when I'm prototyping, I'll do that. And then I can just set the input value to whatever I want, to the same thing. I think it's when you're starting to think of other people using your code that you want to put these protections and safeguards around it and make it more dynamic. If you're the sole developer, then you can do whatever you want. And I think this is also in terms of a learning path, I would make sure this code works before making sure this code works. Because if you see here, you're getting that attribute circle type, you're still using that same logic in order to get that value in your get value of the proper binding, if you will. So the code is going to be a little bit harder to onboard, but I like to start here and then generalize.
Okay.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
Okay. Yeah, go on, Haifa. I was just going to say thank you so much. I mean, for answering all these very difficult questions. And
No, thank you
I mean,
all. And keep them coming online or whatever. This has been so much fun. And I hope it made a little bit of sense. This stuff is really hard.
Yeah, but you made us really excited to learn more about the integration between R and JavaScript. And thank
Amazing.
you. Yeah, thank you so much. I can't thank you enough for contributing to our chapter here in the Middle East and North Africa and making all these materials. Thank you a lot, Maya.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you everyone for joining.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining. Thank you.
Yes. So I also want to thank you, Maya, for answering all those questions, and I want also to thank all our attendees for being interactive and asking questions. It's really amazing. So also I want to thank everyone for attending, and it's like Batul said, a great opportunity for people from Middle East and North Africa to have you, Maya, and learn from you.
Thanks again, everyone. Yeah, and this was a lot of fun.
Okay, bye guys. Thank
Goodbye.
you.
Thank you.
Bye.